lesson 2 on genetics, heritability, and the brain. In this lesson, we're going to talk about some of the biological bases of ADHD. All right, so let's start out with genetics. Research into the human genome has revealed underlying genetic influences for most medical conditions. If you've been keeping up with medical research and medical literature, you know that almost every month or so, there is a new article or new publication talking about a gene that is particularly implicated with a particular disorder or a particular condition. So while historically we've relied on anecdotal and correlational data to make assumptions about the genetic basis of various medical and psychological issues, each piece of new research published reinforces now the actual basis for this genetic relationship to the psychological conditions and health conditions that we're talking about. Now, ADHD is no different. While we have not yet found a specific gene sequence that predicts the presence of ADHD in a person, various research studies have identified profiles that seem to increase the likelihood of the condition. Now, more research is certainly needed in this area, but researchers seem to be confident that in the near future, we will be able to predict ADHD with some level of confidence. My expectation for this is, based upon what I've read in the literature about this, is that it won't be a specific gene or specific gene sequence that we will identify. Rather, it's going to be more like a group of potential sequences that we'll find that predict any of the particular subtypes of ADHD. Now let's move to heritability. Heritability is sort of another way to look at the probability of a genetic root for ADHD. Put simply, heritability tells us the probability that a particular trait, in our case ADHD, is caused by a genetic marker as compared to environmental factors. So while that's a bit of a mouthful, what it basically tells us is this: what is the likelihood that two people with similar genes will both have ADHD? Once again, when we look at these numbers, we see that there's a very strong likelihood of a genetic relationship for ADHD. The prevalence of ADHD in the overall population of children and adolescents is somewhere between 5 and 7%. That means that if you pick any random child from the world, there's a 5 to 7% chance that he or she will have ADHD. However, if you choose a child who has an identical twin with ADHD, that probability increases to 76%. So, having a sibling with similar genes increases the risk or the prevalence or the possibility or the probability of having ADHD from 5 to 7% all the way up to 76%, more than tenfold. So again, there's little doubt that ADHD has its roots in our biology, has its roots in our genes, and is there to be passed down from family to family. And that's where, like I was saying earlier, the anecdotal work that we've done before, where we've seen that if there's a parent with ADHD, there is a high likelihood that a child or their child will also have ADHD. All right, the last component of this lesson is the brain. Now, I'm not going to get into a really deep discussion about neurobiology, but we can't talk about ADHD and the biological roots of ADHD without talking about the brain to some extent. So this lesson could go on for hours if we talked about the brain's relationship with ADHD in detail, but I'm just going to kind of give you a bit of an overview. This area is very extensive, but we'll just touch on it. And if you want more information, you can check out our YouTube channel. It's PAEDEIA, P-A-E-D-E-I-A, and we talk a little bit more about it there. This, of course, isn't really the primary purpose of this lesson, so we have those other resources on our YouTube channel so that you can get a little bit more background if you want. The brain. What I'm going to talk about is the biological root, not necessarily the genetic root, but the biological root of ADHD. And so when we think about this and how the brain relates to ADHD, we think about two primary things that we need to focus on. The first is the function of the brain, and the second is the chemistry of the brain. Functional brain imaging studies have clearly demonstrated that the frontal lobes of individuals with ADHD are underperforming. The frontal lobes, which are very important in inhibition, decision-making, self-monitoring, and other what we call executive functions, tend to be underdeveloped and underperform in children and adults with ADHD. So as a result, there simply isn't enough brain power to control the ADHD symptoms. Now, while the frontal lobes are underperforming, other brain structures associated with motor control, mood, memory processing, sensory differentiation, reward, and pleasure, all are not getting enough fuel to operate and function adequately. Now, the fuel that we're talking about primarily is neurotransmitters, particularly dopamine and norepinephrine. So what we need in those situations, and what we're talking about here now, is the chemistry. The functional part is the frontal lobes and some other underlying areas. The functional aspect is this lack of fuel that the brain of an ADHD person seems to struggle with. And that fuel, again, is the neurotransmitters. And so what we need, and what those brain areas that are underperforming need, is stimulation. And that's what dopamine and norepinephrine would do if it were present. And so they seek this stimulation in any way they can get it. Well, when it's not offered biologically, chemically, it seeks it elsewhere. So we know that kids and adults with ADHD are impulsive, they engage in risk-taking behaviors and things like that. Those things stimulate the brain. And so when we see these kinds of behaviors in kids and adults with ADHD, we know that many of those behaviors are really, at its roots, focused on increasing stimulation in the brain. So there's little wonder that kids with ADHD are bouncing off the walls and impulsively climbing and jumping off of things, and they want to engage in the most dangerous and risky activities and things, because that's what's going to stimulate their brain. They need dopamine, and those behaviors provide dopamine. Now, when you take these together, it makes this strong argument for the biological basis of ADHD, whether it's our genetic presentation, or it's the biological functioning, the brain functioning and chemistry that suggests the biological basis. We know that ADHD is a disorder of the brain. There is no doubt. Neurologists work with kids with ADHD, psychiatrists work with kids with ADHD, and all of us agree that the way that ADHD presents suggests that it is a biological disorder. So when we claim that, again, kind of going back to that recurring theme that I told you about, when we think about the phenomenon of the kid's behavior that is challenging and frustrating and overwhelming for parents, and we see it as intentional, willful disobedience, when we really get down to it, it is a brain-based condition. We wouldn't punish our kids if their eyesight wasn't good enough for them to see what we asked them to look at. And similarly, we shouldn't punish them for behaviors that they engage in simply because they can't keep from behaving that way. They can't stop themselves from behaving this way without additional strategies. With the poor eyesight, we use glasses. So for ADHD, we need some other strategies. We need some other recommendations and approaches for dealing with these behaviors so that kids can be more successful. So when we think about it, we need to make sure that we approach ADHD with the understanding that it is a brain-based condition. And with that understanding, we will approach the condition in a very different way and from a very different mindset. So hope that was helpful. And again, write to us on the message boards if you have any questions. We're happy to answer them. And do check out our YouTube page to get a little bit more information about these biological bases.